mid-20th century may be my favorite period in American history for surprising and various poetry. It's also the last time period we're going to look at in this historical survey that has, I think, poets that are obviously indelible, that will never go away as long as American literature is treasured. Let's start with the immediate aftermath of modernism. Now, modernism is usually seen as a movement which goes up until the World War. Especially we're thinking of World War II here, that starts in 1939. And America, of course, gets involved in the war a few years later after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. But World War II really marks this shift in consciousness of American culture, in consciousness of history. And so we can see the poetry written, even by people like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound and others in the 20s and 30s as being markedly different than the poetry that's being written in the mid-40s onward. T.S. Eliot himself wrote poetry after World War II and before World War II, and you see a little bit of a change in consciousness. A poet who began writing in the modernist period, but wrote his most famous poems in the mid-century, was a poet named Langston Hughes. Now, Langston Hughes was part of what's called the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance starts in the 20s in Harlem. It's sort of this explosion of production by Black artists, Black writers, Black musicians, and Langston Hughes is at the center of it. One of the things that Langston Hughes does that's so important in poetry, in later modernism into the mid-century poetry, is this trying to infuse jazz rhythms into poetry. Now, jazz was important in poetry before Langston Hughes came along, and yet the real powerful cultural ferment of the Harlem Renaissance puts jazz into music in a way that T.S. Eliot hadn't quite got to. T.S. Eliot is sometimes talked about as having jazz rhythms, but they're very pronounced in a very explicitly American way in Langston Hughes' poetry. Let's look at perhaps his most famous poem. This is called Harlem. This was published in 1951. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? That last line is its own stanza, and it's in italicized typeface. There's a real insistence at the end. You can see that there's rhyme in this and a loose meter. The metrics aren't exact. You don't have the same exact number of syllables in each line. But there's this loose, rhyming, rhythmic quality to this poem. And it's short. It's the type of poem that you could memorize. It's interesting because the first line and the last line are their own stanzas. And in the middle, we have one big stanza that has this alternating rhyme scheme. Up, sun, soar, run, meet, over, sweet, sags, load, explode. This idea of the dream deferred, of course, is going to be drawn on by Martin Luther King in his I Have a Dream speech. And the dream deferred isn't just talking about civil rights. It's going back to the dream of Reconstruction and maybe even the dream that we saw in Frances Ellen Watkins' Ethiopia. This idea of this promise of American freedom that is continually deferred, and which Black poets, especially in each age of American poetry, continue to write about, to wrestle with, and to ask, when is the dream coming? Of course, the Civil Rights Act wouldn't be until the late 60s, and even then, we can arguably see society as deferring the dream. But Langston Hughes, in the poem Harlem, crystallizes this question of the dream deferred into perhaps one of the most famous poems in all of the mid-century American poetry. Let's look at another aspect of the poetry of the late 40s, early 50s, which is this reminiscence of World War II. Randall Jarrell, was a poet who lived through World War II and writes about it in a famous short poem called The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner. The death of the ball turret gunner. From my mother's sleep I fell into the state, and I hunched in its belly till my wet fur froze. 6 miles from earth, loosed from its dream of life, I woke to black flak and the nightmare fighters. When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose. This is a short poem. It's only 5 lines long. It's got a loose rhyme: state, froze, life, fighters, hose. Froze and hose are rhyming. The lines, they're not quite iambic, but they feel like an iambic pentameter line that's kind of been loosened up in its rhythm, kind of like the rhythm that's going on in Harlem as well. If we think about the rhythmic qualities of this poem, we'll notice that instead of an alternating rhythm, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, in a regular pattern, Jarell likes to bunch together single stress-syllable words into these packed phrases. So, wet fur froze at the end of the second line. Black flak in the fourth line. These are if you have 2 stress syllables in a row, we call that a spondee. These spondee and spondaic rhythms are sort of emphasizing, I think, a close packedness. And if you read the poem and think about it, it reveals itself as a poem about a man who's in a ball turret. And, it's helpful to see an illustration of this, but these were kind of these glassed-in semi-globes that would hang off the bottom of military aircraft that would have a machine gun sticking out of them, and they could swivel, and there was a guy packed in there with his fur jacket on who's shooting down enemy fighters. I woke to black flak and the nightmare fighters. But this isn't just a documentary, description of what it was like to be there in World War II, hanging off the bottom of a plane. It's kind of a birth narrative, too. From my mother's sleep, I fell into the state. There's this idea of being birthed from the mother into the state. I woke to black flak and the nightmare fighters. It's almost this, he's coming to consciousnness, and the consciousness is the chaos of war. And then there's this really pitiful ending. When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose. This isn't this monumental ceremonial burial of the honored fallen soldier, washing him out with a steam hose. There's this indication there's going to be another guy that gets packed in there and will probably die too. This is a poetry that has reminded others of the World War II or World War I poetry that came particularly out of England, that has a very negative, sometimes even nihilistic view of war. And Jarell himself would struggle with mental health, and became a poet who was seen as synonymous with this worry that war had broken the men who were part of it. Speaking of broken people, by the late 40s, early 50s, another movement was starting that was not as explicitly engaging with wartime experience, but kind of exploring the psyche of America as the baby boom starts. And this is the Beat movement. The Beat movement was centered especially in San Francisco, and though some of the Beat poets and writers and artists also hung out in Greenwich Village in New York, probably the most famous Beat poet is the Jewish American Allen Ginsberg. Allen Ginsberg is most famous for a poem he wrote called Howl, which was almost as much of a performance piece as it was a poem to be sort of read, sitting at your leisure. And you can go and find recordings of Ginsberg reading this. Now, Ginsberg's Howl has a lot in common with Whitman, and it has these really long, rambly lines. But it was a little more frank and explicit about American degeneracy and the difficulty of modern life in a way that actually alerted the censors. And Howl, when it was published by Lawrence Ferlinghetti, by City Lights Books, which was this kind of like little rebel publisher in San Francisco in the 50s, the shipments of the copies of the book were actually confiscated, and there's whole books and movies dedicated to the trial and the controversy over Howl. What was so controversial? Well, Ginsberg uses very strong curse words in it, which were seen as unfit to print. But also the attitude toward America in Howl is very, very cynical. The opening line is famous: "I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness." And it goes on and on to talk about sort of the madness, degeneracy, kind of mental distress of modern America. Howl is too long to read you here, but I want to read you a poem by Ginsberg that I think maybe encapsulates his thinking about his place in the tradition a little better than Howl does. This is called A Supermarket in California. This was published in 1955, and it was collected with Howl in a little booklet that's worth picking up if you like what you see from Ginsberg. This is called A Supermarket in California. What thoughts I have of you tonight, Walt Whitman, for I walk down the side streets under the trees with a headache, self-conscious, looking at the full moon. In my hungry fatigue and shopping for images, I went into the neon fruit supermarket, dreaming of your enumerations. What peaches and penumbras, whole families shopping at night, aisles full of husbands, wives in the avocados, babies in the tomatoes, and you, Garcia Lorca. What were you doing down by the watermelons? I saw you, Walt Whitman, childless, lonely old grubber, poking among the meats in the refrigerator and eyeing the grocery boys. I heard you asking questions of each. Who killed the pork chops? What price bananas? Are you my angel? I wandered in and out of the brilliant stacks of cans following you, and followed in my imagination by the store detective. We strode down the open corridors together in our solitary fancy, tasting artichokes, possessing every frozen delicacy, and never passing the cashier. Where are we going, Walt Whitman? The doors close in an hour. Which way does your beard point tonight? I touch your book and dream of our odyssey in the supermarket and feel absurd. Will we walk all night through solitary streets? The trees add shade to shade, lights out in the houses. We'll both be lonely. Will we stroll daydreaming of the lost America of love past blue automobiles in driveways, home to our silent cottage? Ah, dear father, graybeard, lonely old courage teacher, what America did you have when Charon quit poling his ferry and you got out on a smoking bank and stood watching the boat disappear on the black waters of Lethe? This poem is very weird, and it's a good encapsulation of the kind of things that Ginsberg does. There's this kind of gentle, jokey, like, I was at the supermarkets and the babies were playing in the tomatoes. It's got this kind of like free association, jazz, American, domestic feel. But then it raises itself into this vision of Walt Whitman, walking with the author through the dark streets looking for America. And then we have this final image, which is so very Ginsberg, when all of a sudden we're in this classical underworld scene. And Whitman is waiting for Charon the boatman to come bring him across the river Lethe into hell itself. Ginsberg is not everyone's cup of tea, and the lines that he writes often feel more like paragraphs than lines. For instance, this first line of the poem, "What thoughts I have of you tonight, Walt Whitman, for I walk down the side streets under the trees with a headache, self-conscious, looking at the full moon." That's one line of poetry. I mentioned he was a lot like Whitman, and obviously he's explicitly engaging with Whitman in this poem, kind of saying, I'm following you. But he's even extending out Whitman's longest lines into what could almost be called prose poetry chunks. And yet he's questioning I think, the very form and tradition he's writing in. Where are we going, Walt Whitman, is the opening part of the first line of the last stanza. There's this explicit, where are we going? Where are you taking me? Are we going to the underworld together? Ginsberg was an interesting poet in that he really wanted to say big things about America. More, I think, explicitly and on the nose than even someone like Randall Jarrell. An interesting story about Ginsberg is he tracked down Ezra Pound when Ezra Pound was an old man. Now, we mentioned Ezra Pound in the last video, and Ezra Pound was a very important modernist. He also got caught up in the 1930s in Italian fascism and ended up kind of traitorously betraying the American cause and working for the fascist government. He was imprisoned by the U.S. government after World War II. He was declared unfit to stand trial because of mental distress. And he ended up in a sort of kind of half-ashamed retirement. Ginsberg tracked down Pound and tried to befriend him and confront him about his anti-Semitism and his fascism. Ginsberg really wanted to understand America, and the beat poetry tradition that he helped to invent, I think, is one of the great mid-century explorations of what do we do with all that's come before. We are self-consciously American in the Whitmanian tradition, but boy is the world messed up, and boy is my poetry not just going to solve and put everything together. An aspect of this worry about the state, not just of the American society, but the American mind, comes out in another group of poets who come of age and begin writing very powerful poetry in the late 50s and into the 60s. And this is the confessional poets. Now, I've already done a video about confessionalism, but I want to highlight it here again because it's kind of the other side of the beat movement. The beat movement wants to ask big questions, but be honest about things like mental illness and, hospitalization and anti-Semitism and the problems that were plaguing American culture in the mid-century. But the confessionals took it even a step further into introspection, not just of society, but of one's own self, of one's own family. There's a strong therapeutic element to the confessional. Let's look at perhaps the most famous confessional poem by Sylvia Plath. This was published in 1962. This is called Daddy. And I warn you, this poem gets real raw real fast. You do not do any more black shoe in which I lived like a foot for 30 years, poor and white, barely daring to breathe or achoo. Daddy, I have had to kill you. You died before I had time. Marble heavy, a bag full of God, ghastly statue with one gray toe, big as a Frisco seal, and a head in the freakish Atlantic, where it pours bean green over blue in the waters off beautiful Nostet. I used to pray to recover you. Ach, du, in the German tongue in the Polish town, scraped flat by the roller of wars, wars, wars. But the name of the town is common. My Polack friend says there are a dozen or two, so I could never tell where you put your foot, your root. I never could talk to you. The tongue stuck in my jaw. It stuck in a barbed wire snare. Ich, ich. I could hardly speak. I thought every German was you, and the language obscene. An engine, chuffing me off like a Jew. A Jew to Dachau, Auschwitz, Belsen. I began to talk like a Jew. I think I may well be a Jew. The snows of the Tyrol, the clear beer of Vienna, are not very pure or true. With my gypsy ancestress and my weird luck and my Tarok pack, I may be a bit of a Jew. I have always been scared of you with your Luftwaffe, your gobbledygoo, and your neat mustache, and your Aryan eye, bright blue. Panzerman, oh, you, no god but a swastika, so black no sky could squeak through. Every woman adores a fascist, the boot in the face, the brute heart of a brute like you. You stand at the blackboard, Daddy, in the picture I have of you, a cleft in your chin instead of your foot, but no less a devil for that. No, not any less the black man who bit my pretty red heart in two. I was 10 when they buried you. At 20 I tried to die and get back to you. I thought even the bones would do. But they pulled me out of the sack and they stuck me together with glue. And then I knew what to do. I made a model of you, a man in black with a Mein Kampf look and a love of the rack and the screw. And I said, I do. So, Daddy, I'm finally through. The black telephone's off at the root. The voices just can't worm through. If I've killed a man, I've killed two. A vampire who said he was you and drank my blood for a year. 7 years, if you want to know. Daddy, you can lie back now. There's a stake in your fat black heart, and the villagers never liked you. They are dancing and stamping on you. They always knew it was you. Daddy, you bastard, I'm through. This poem, like Howl and like a lot of Ginsberg's poems, I think revealed just a rawness and an honesty about one's frustration, both familially and culturally, that we hadn't quite seen before in American poetry. Yes, Langston Hughes, yes, T.S. Eliot, they're talking about the struggle of Americans and the, wishing for goodness and only finding rejection. But the register of the language of the beats and the confessionals is new and was very, very palatable and attractive to the 60s counterculture movement, which the beats certainly helped to birth and the confessionals were part of and tried to articulate. The 60s counterculture needed a poetry and a language that was their own, and they got it in these movements. You can see so much of World War II in Plath's Daddy, to the point where she's, using terms for Nazi things and talking about the Holocaust and identifying herself with the Jews. And it's very uncomfortable and shocking, I think, even to our contemporary sensibilities who have been thinking about these things for decades. I think they were even more raw and shocking to her audience. And, her father was not a Nazi, and yet she's painting this picture of a man who clearly she had a bad relationship with, who she was traumatized by. She paints him as a Nazi. And she then says, you made me adore the fascists, and so I tried to find other men like you. And they treated me horribly too. And then there's this kind of swearing off of all those men, including especially the father, at the end with, Daddy, you bastard, I'm through. Sylvia Plath, who we've talked about in other videos, died tragically by her own hand in 1960s. And this death, I think, cemented her, and once again, we've talked about this before, but I need to highlight this. The death before her time, after writing these poems, they're angry at her father, they're angry at, ultimately her husband, Ted Hughes, who very much treated her horribly. They cemented Sylvia Plath as maybe the last great tragic poet of American history. There were other great tragic poets. Elizabeth Bishop is someone who we should talk about more, who was writing alongside Sylvia Plath. But I think no poet after Plath has had quite the cultural saturation that Plath had, who seemed to sum up in her life and in her poetry the things that most mattered in her age. Eliot's close, but Eliot is a modernist. Where do we go after the confessionals? What do we do with the living poets? We'll talk about that in our last video in this series. Thanks for hanging out with us. Thanks for hanging out with this poetry that's getting rawer, that's getting more uncomfortable, and yet is still meditating on these questions and these themes that have been particularly poignant ever since the founding of America. Thank you.